Cops target a black homeless veteran at a diner until one phone call destroys their career. It was a quiet morning at Joe's Diner, nestled in the heart of the city's old downtown district. The sun was barely peeking through the windows, casting a soft glow over the checkered floor and the faded vinyl booths. The smell of sizzling bacon, freshly brewed coffee, and toasted bread filled the air. It was the kind of place that felt like home to its regulars, people who came for the comfort food and the warm, familiar faces. One of those faces was that of Marcus Carter, a black, homeless veteran who had been coming to Joe's every day for the past few months. Marcus was a man of few words, but his presence had become a constant fixture at the diner. He always sat at the same booth near the window, his military jacket worn and patched from years of service. His hands were rough, calloused from the years of hard labor and his time in the military. His face was weathered, not just from age, but from the strain of the life he had lived. He had served his country with pride. But after returning home, he found himself lost in a world that no longer seemed to have a place for him. He'd been on the streets for a long time, struggling with both physical and emotional scars from his time in the military. But there was something about Joe's Diner that made Marcus feel like he wasn't invisible. The owner, Joe, was a veteran himself, and he treated Marcus with the respect he deserved. The staff, mostly young waiters and waitresses, never judged him, even though he didn't always have enough to pay for his meals. They knew Marcus didn't ask for charity, he simply wanted a warm place to sit and a hot cup of coffee to steady his nerves. On that particular morning, Marcus was nursing a cup of black coffee and staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. The diner was slow, with only a few regulars scattered around. He hadn't said much to anyone that day. He was tired, his body aching from the cold night he'd spent in a nearby alley. The nights were the hardest, the cold seeped into his bones, and the loneliness felt like a constant companion. As he stared out at the gray sky, he noticed a police car pull up outside. It wasn't unusual for officers to drive by the diner, but something about this morning felt different. Marcus wasn't sure why, but a feeling of unease settled in his gut. He had been on the receiving end of many cold stares from law enforcement during his time on the streets, and he knew all too well the way they looked at people like him, veterans without a home, lost to the world and forgotten by society. Two officers stepped out of the squad car and entered the diner. They were young, maybe in their late 20s, and dressed in standard police uniforms. One of them, Officer Walker, had a cocky air about him, his jaw set in a way that suggested he had something to prove. The other officer, Officer Martinez, seemed quieter, more reserved, but Marcus could see the glint of authority in his eyes. They walked past Marcus's booth, and for a moment, Marcus thought they might just sit down for coffee like any other customer. But as they approached, they stopped. Officer Walker glanced down at Marcus, his eyes scanning him from head to toe. "Hey, you're not causing trouble, are you?" Officer Walker asked, his voice loud and condescending. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Marcus looked up, surprised but not shocked. He had been through this kind of thing before, many times. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but he knew the drill. Still, something about the officer's tone grated on him. "I'm just having my coffee," Marcus replied calmly, his voice steady, trying to keep the peace. He had learned long ago that conflict with the police rarely ended well for someone like him. "Yeah, well, you don't look like you're just having coffee," Officer Walker shot back, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you're here to cause problems." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The words stung, and he could feel the eyes of the other customers in the diner turning toward him. He hated being looked at like that, as if he was some sort of nuisance, a problem to be dealt with. "I'm not causing any problems," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice even. "I'm just trying to get through the day." Officer Walker didn't seem to care about Marcus's words. He leaned in closer, looming over the table. "I think it's time for you to leave. We don't want any trouble here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. At that moment, Marcus felt a surge of frustration welling up inside him. He had been humiliated enough in his life. He wasn't going to let these officers do the same thing to him now. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation, but he wasn't about to be pushed around either. Before he could respond, Officer Martinez stepped in. "Walker, let's not escalate this. He's not doing anything wrong." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension to it. He seemed more cautious, aware of the situation. Walker, however, wasn't ready to back down. He shot Martinez a glare. "No, he's not doing anything wrong now, but I don't trust people like him," he said, sneering at Marcus. At that moment, Marcus's patience ran out. He wasn't just some problem to be solved. He had served his country, bled for it, and now he was treated like dirt. Enough was enough. With a steady hand, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. He had been preparing for this moment for a long time. As the phone rang, the officers stood there, watching him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Marcus didn't look up at them as the phone connected. "Hello, this is Marcus Carter," he said when the other end picked up. "I need to speak with someone from Internal Affairs. It's urgent." The officers' expressions faltered for a split second, but neither of them spoke. Marcus continued speaking into the phone, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, I'm at Joe's Diner on 3rd and Main, and I'm being harassed by 2 officers from the local precinct. One of them, Officer Walker, is targeting me for no reason. He's been disrespectful and has been trying to force me out of the diner. I need to file a formal complaint, and I need it documented." There was a long pause on the other end of the line as Marcus's words sank in. He could feel the tension rise in the air. Officer Walker glanced at Officer Martinez, his face turning a shade of red as he realized what was happening. "Sir, we're just trying to do our job," Officer Martinez said, trying to defuse the situation, but it was too late. Marcus had already taken the first step to ensuring this wouldn't be swept under the rug. "I've been doing my job too, officer," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "I serve this country, and now I'm just trying to have a peaceful meal. You're the ones causing the problem." The phone call continued, and the more Marcus spoke, the more nervous the officers became. The diners around them were starting to take notice, their whispers growing louder as they overheard the conversation. No one had expected this kind of turn of events. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the call ended, and Marcus hung up. He looked up at the officers, his expression calm and composed. "I've filed the complaint," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Now, I suggest you leave me alone." Officer Walker's face was flushed with anger, but he said nothing. Officer Martinez, meanwhile, was silent, his eyes darting back and forth between Marcus and his partner. Without another word, they turned and left the diner, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The diner remained still for a moment before the tension finally broke. People began to murmur, some exchanging looks of surprise, others nodding in approval. Marcus sat back in his booth, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. The phone call had been a simple one, but it had changed everything. Marcus had known that he had to take action, that his rights were worth defending, and that he couldn't let the cycle of mistreatment continue. That phone call would go on to have ripple effects far beyond that diner. The Internal Affairs investigation would eventually uncover the pattern of misconduct that Officer Walker and others in the precinct had engaged in for months. Within weeks, both officers were suspended and eventually fired. The department faced a public outcry, and several other complaints against the officers surfaced, all pointing to a culture of abuse and harassment toward homeless individuals and veterans. Marcus never came back to Joe's Diner again, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't need to prove anything anymore. His dignity had been restored, and the phone call had ensured that the cycle of abuse was finally broken. And while his life on the streets remained difficult, that moment at the diner had marked a turning point for him, a moment when he stopped being the victim and took control of his own story. As for the officers, their careers were ruined, a consequence of their own arrogance and disregard for the law. They learned the hard way that no one was invisible, not Marcus, not anyone.